In the frozen wasteland of the Mongolian steppes, a 9-year-old boy watched his father's allies ride away, abandoning his family to certain death. The year was 1171, and young Temujin had just learned his first brutal lesson about power, that loyalty dies the moment weakness shows. Tonight, we'll walk through the survival years that transformed an outcast child into the most feared conqueror in human history. And if stories like this help you unwind at the end of your day, a quiet like and subscribe would help this channel reach other history lovers seeking peaceful sleep. I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your corner of the world? Now settle in as we explore how 11 years of betrayal, hunger, and violence forged the mind of Genghis Khan. The morning started, like any other, on the vast Mongolian plateau. In the camp of Dey Sechin of the Ongirat tribe, 8-year-old Temujin woke to the familiar sounds of pastoral life. Horses snorting in the cold air, the crackle of dried dung fires, and the low voices of his future in-laws planning the day's activities. His father, Yasuge, had departed just days earlier, leaving his son to fulfill the traditional bride price service with Berta's family. It was meant to be a simple arrangement, the kind that had built tribal alliances for generations. But the steppes had their own rules about simple arrangements. Life in 12th century Mongolia was a delicate balance of survival and politics. Tribes formed alliances through marriage, warfare, and shared necessity. Yasuge had mastered this deadly game, building a network of loyalty that kept his people fed and protected until an old enemy decided the game needed to end. The journey home should have been routine for an experienced leader like Yasuge, but fate intervened when he encountered a group of Tatars who had struck camp to eat along the route. Following nomadic custom of hospitality, he accepted their invitation to share their meal, unaware they had recognized him from past conflicts. Yasuge, the Kian, has come, they whispered, remembering the raids he had led against their people. Poison was a weapon of choice among the steppe peoples. It left no wounds to prove murder, no blood to demand revenge. The Tatars had perfected this art, and they had just removed one of their greatest threats without lifting a sword. The poison they slipped into Yasuge's food was not fast-acting. He would have time to reach home, but not to survive. When the messenger arrived at Dey Sechin's camp, his horse was lathered with sweat, its sides heaving from a desperate ride across the steppes. The man's face told the story before his words did. Yasuge was dying, possibly already dead, and young Temujin was needed at home immediately. The journey home became a race against time that Temujin would lose. By the time he reached his family's camp, his father had already breathed his last, leaving behind a widow, several young children, and a power vacuum that would reshape their world. Temujin watched his mother Hoylun's face as she calculated their family's chances of survival. On the steppes, a dead leader meant his followers were free to choose their own path, and a path that included feeding extra mouths through a harsh winter wasn't appealing to anyone. The Taichud followers, Yasuge's Nokkod, who had sworn loyalty through years of shared victories, didn't wait for the burial ceremony to end. As Yasuge's body lay wrapped in white felt according to tradition, the whispering started. Quiet conversations by cooking fires, where men weighed their options. Horses being quietly loaded as families prepared for departure. Hoelun was no ordinary woman. She had been captured from the Merkids, but had earned respect through her strength and wisdom. She made desperate appeals to the departing clans, offering to share their remaining herds, promising eternal loyalty, suggesting strategic marriages for her sons. The men listened politely, but their minds were already made up. The Taïchud leaders spoke for them all when they delivered their judgment. The deep water has dried up, the shining stone is worn away. It is over. These were men who had fought beside Yesugei for years, who had sworn blood oaths of eternal brotherhood. Now they spoke of him like he was already forgotten. One by one, they mounted their horses and rode away. They took the tribal herds, the horses, sheep, and cattle that represented survival. They took the protection of numbers that made the difference between life and death. They left behind a widow, 4 young boys, 1 baby girl, and 2 loyal servants. 7 people against the infinite cruelty of winter. As the dust settled and silence fell over the abandoned campsite, 9-year-old Temujin made a promise to himself that would reshape the world. He memorized every face that rode away, burning their features into his memory. He remembered every word of abandonment. The boy understood something that would guide his entire life. Loyalty was worthless unless backed by fear, and mercy was a weakness that enemies would always exploit. One day, when he had the strength, he would make them all pay for this lesson in human nature. The steppes showed no mercy to the weak, and winter was coming fast. But something was already changing in the boy's eyes as he watched the last riders disappear. A hardness that hadn't been there before. A cold calculation that would one day terrify nations. The making of a monster had begun. Chapter 2. Learning to Survive. The first lesson of survival came within hours of the tribe's departure. As the sun set on their first night alone, Hoelun gathered her children around the dying fire and spoke words that would echo in Temujin's mind forever. We must survive together, or we will die together. The abandoned campsite told the story of their new reality with brutal clarity. Where once dozens of fires had warmed the night, now only one small flame flickered against the vast darkness. The silence was deafening. No horses neighing, no children playing, no old men sharing stories of battle and glory. Just the endless wind across empty grassland and the distant howl of wolves who sensed weakness. Everything useful had been taken. The iron tools, weapons, cooking pots, warm blankets, precious salt, dried meat stores, all loaded onto horses and carried away. What remained was worse than nothing. Broken tent stakes, torn fabric, empty containers. The skeleton of what had once been a thriving community. Hoelun took charge with steel determination that surprised even herself. For over a decade, she had been a chieftain's wife, living comfortably by steppe standards. Her days had been filled with supervising servants, weaving patterns into cloth, managing tribal politics. Now she became teacher, hunter, strategist, and warrior. Within days, her soft hands were cracked and bleeding from gathering firewood. Her elaborate hairstyles gave way to practical braids. She was becoming something harder and more dangerous. The first rule she established was simple and revolutionary. Everyone contributes, or everyone starves. There would be no favoritism based on age or gender, no exceptions for weakness, no room for the luxury of childhood. The steps didn't care about family politics. Survival was a team effort where every member had to earn their place. 9-year-old Temujin became the family's primary hunter, armed with nothing but a crude bow made from scavenged wood and sinew, and arrows tipped with sharpened bone. The bow was too big for his hands, the draw weight almost too much for his young muscles. Every morning, he set out with equipment that would have embarrassed a grown warrior, carrying the bitter knowledge that failure meant watching his siblings grow weaker and more hollow-eyed. His younger brothers received their own impossible assignments. Khassar, barely 7, but already showing the keen eye that would make him famous as an archer, became responsible for gathering anything remotely edible: wild onions buried beneath frost, withered berries, field mice caught in primitive traps. 5-year-old Hachian learned to identify edible roots and collect dried grass that could be boiled into thin, bitter soup. Little Temuga gathered dried dung for fuel and helped process whatever food the older boys managed to bring home. The Mongolian steppes in late autumn were a harsh teacher that showed no mercy. Game was scarce and increasingly wary. The weather turned bitter without warning. Water sources were often frozen or contaminated. Every single day brought lessons in how close to death a family could live while still breathing. Temujin's first successful hunt came 3 weeks into their exile. A lone marmot, fat with winter preparations, had been following a predictable pattern near a cluster of rocks. Temujin had been studying the creature for days, learning its habits, waiting for the perfect opportunity. When the moment came, his crude arrow flew true and found its mark. The family ate meat for the first time since abandonment, and the meal became a ceremony of survival. They cooked every part with ritual precision. Nothing was wasted, because waste had become suicide. But even this victory carried a dark lesson. As they shared the precious protein, Temujin noticed how his brothers looked at the meat with calculating intensity, weighing portions with merchant precision. Hunger was changing them, making them suspicious and calculating in ways that would have been unthinkable in their old life of abundance. Chapter 3. The Seeds of Violence. The psychological transformation was subtle but relentless. As months passed and Temujin grew from a boy of 9 into a youth approaching 14, the family dynamics that had once been governed by simple childhood hierarchies began shifting towards something more dangerous. The struggle for survival had initially united them, but time and persistent hardship were revealing deeper fractures that would eventually demand blood payment. Temujin's position as primary hunter had given him practical authority over daily decisions, but Bekta's status as the oldest male child created competing claims to leadership that became more problematic as both boys approached adulthood. The conflict had been building through countless small incidents that might have been trivial in abundance, but became serious sources of resentment in perpetual scarcity. The breaking point came on a spring day when the 4 brothers, Temujin, Khassar, Bekta, and Belgute, had gone fishing together. When their patience was finally rewarded and they caught a bright fish, the old family tensions immediately reasserted themselves. Bekta and Belgutay simply snatched the small fish away from Temujin and Kasar before the younger brothers could secure their catch. A bright minnow bit the hook and was snatched away from us by our two brothers Bekta and Belguti, they reported to their mother. Hurlun's response revealed her impossible position. Why do you, older and younger brothers, behave in such a way towards one another? It was less an answer than an expression of exhausted frustration. For Temujin, his mother's non-response was final confirmation that traditional family authority was inadequate to their circumstances. If Hoelun couldn't establish clear rules about fairness and contribution, then he would take matters into his own hands. The fish itself was irrelevant. What mattered was the principle that those who contributed to survival shouldn't have their efforts casually appropriated by those who contributed less. The decision to kill Bekta was made with cold calculation. This wasn't a crime of passion, but a strategic decision based on careful analysis of the threat that Bekta's behavior represented to their family's survival and Temujin's authority. He enlisted Kasar's participation because joint action would demonstrate that this wasn't individual violence, but a collective decision by the family's productive members. They found their half-brother watching over their small herd of horses. The choice of location was tactically sound, isolated enough to prevent intervention while being associated with one of the few times when Bekta was actually performing useful work. Bekta's response to seeing his half-brothers approaching with drawn bows revealed both his understanding and his acceptance of what was about to occur. Instead of begging for mercy or attempting to flee, he sat cross-legged and spoke with dignity. We are unable to endure the bitterness that our Taichi-Ut kinsmen have caused us, and ask ourselves, which of us will settle the score? Why make me to be dirt in your eye, a fishbone in your mouth, at a time when we have no companions other than our shadows, no whips other than our horses' tails? How can you think to do this thing? Do not extinguish my hearth fire. Do not forsake Belgute. The speech acknowledged their desperate circumstances and questioned whether internal violence was the right response to external threats. But his words couldn't change the fundamental calculation that had led to this moment. Temujin and Kasar shot at him from in front and from behind, ensuring death came quickly. Then they departed, leaving the body to be discovered later. When they returned home, Hurlun took one look at their faces and knew immediately what had happened. Her reaction was swift and harsh. She called them destroyers, a word that carried the full weight of her grief and horror at what her sons had become capable of. The transformation of 14-year-old Temujin was now complete in its essential elements. The boy who had once played peacefully in his father's camp was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required the elimination of obstacles, even family members. The steps had created their monster, one calculated decision at a time. Chapter 4. The Fish That Changed Everything. The confrontation with Bekta had been building for months, but it wasn't hunger alone that drove the final conflict. By the time Temujin reached his 14th year, the dynamics within their struggling family had shifted beyond simple survival into a battle for leadership that would define the rest of his life. Bekta, as the oldest of Yesuge's sons from his second wife, carried himself with confidence that came from believing he would inherit leadership. Even in their reduced circumstances, he expected deference from his younger half-brothers and continued to assert authority in ways that increasingly grated against Temujin's developing sense of leadership. The tensions manifested in countless small ways. When food was distributed, Bekta claimed the largest portions by right of seniority. When decisions needed to be made, he expected his voice to carry the most weight. Most frustratingly, he had begun treating the fruits of Temujin's successful hunts as communal property that he could redistribute as he saw fit, while contributing relatively little himself. The breaking point came when the ice finally began to break up on the streams. For the first time in months, fresh fish became possible. The four brothers had positioned themselves around a pool, each working their makeshift equipment with focused intensity. When the first bite came on Temujin's line, just a bright silver minnow that would have been thrown back in times of abundance, it represented precious protein in their current circumstances. But as Temujin reached to secure his catch, Bekta's hand shot out and snatched the fish away. The movement was casual, dismissive, as if taking the results of his younger brother's effort was his natural right. Belgide moved to support Bekta's claim, creating a 2-against-2 situation that transformed success into bitter dispute. For Temujin, this casual appropriation was the final confirmation that traditional structures were no longer adequate. The logic was as clear and cold as the spring water. Bekta's behavior represented a threat to functionality, and threats had to be eliminated. The execution was swift and definitive. Following their plan, Temujin positioned himself behind Bekta, while Kasa took position in front. When they released their arrows, death came quickly and without prolonged suffering. It was violence, but it was also efficiency designed to minimize pain while achieving its necessary objective. The immediate aftermath brought both relief and new challenges. The constant tensions disappeared overnight, replaced by a new dynamic where Temujin's leadership was unquestioned. Food distribution became more equitable, with portions based on contribution rather than birth order. Decision-making became more efficient. But the psychological impact on Temujin was complex and profound. He had crossed a line that separated him forever from the child he had once been. More importantly, the success of this violent solution established a pattern of thinking that would influence all his future decisions. When traditional structures failed to address critical problems, direct action could provide solutions. When negotiation proved inadequate, violence could be both effective and justified if it served the larger goal of group survival. As spring progressed and the family's situation gradually improved, the memory of Bekta's death settled into their collective consciousness, not as traumatic aberration, but as necessary turning point that had established better leadership. For 14-year-old Temujin, the killing marked the end of his childhood and the beginning of his evolution into something entirely new. The steppes had claimed another victim, but they had also forged another predator. Chapter 5. The Cangue and the Kindness of Strangers. The killing of Bekta solved the immediate leadership crisis. But it also created a far more dangerous problem. In the interconnected world of Mongolian tribal politics, the deliberate murder of a half-brother could not remain private. Word traveled swiftly across the grasslands, reaching the ears of Targutai Kiriltuch, the Taichuid leader who had abandoned Temujin's family years earlier. For Targutai, the news provided both opportunity and threat. The boy's violent action provided perfect justification for intervention. The Mongols considered spilling kinsman's blood a serious crime. But the fact that young Temujin had proven capable of calculated violence suggested he was becoming exactly the kind of dangerous enemy Targutai had feared. The war party that rode out to capture Temujin consisted of 20 experienced warriors. Their approach was methodical. They surrounded the camp at dawn, when resistance would be futile. When Temujin saw the warriors surrounding them, his first instinct was to fight. But Hoelin's desperate intervention prevented suicidal battle. She understood that her son's death would accomplish nothing beyond satisfying Targutai's fear. The Cangue they locked around his neck was both practical restraint and psychological torture. Made from heavy wood like an oversized collar, it prevented the wearer from reaching his own head or hands to his mouth, making eating, drinking, and sleeping almost impossible without assistance. Most importantly, it made escape extremely difficult. The system of rotating guards represented sophisticated psychological warfare. By assigning different families responsibility for watching Temujin on rotating schedules, Targutai ensured the prisoner would be constantly reminded of his dependence while preventing him from building relationship that might lead to sympathy. But the system contained the seeds of its own failure. Not every Mongol family felt comfortable participating in extended torment of a 14-year-old boy. The family of Sorkhan Shira represented this growing sympathy. When their turn came to supervise the prisoner, they would quietly remove the heavy Cangue at night, allowing him to sleep without constant pain. They dressed his wounds and treated him with basic human dignity. This kindness carried enormous personal risk. Discovery could have resulted in their entire family being accused of treason. Yet they continued to provide relief, motivated by basic decency and growing recognition that Temujin might represent something more significant than a simple criminal. The prisoner's behavior during captivity was as important as his guard's kindness. Rather than allowing humiliation to break his spirit, Temujin used the experience as education in the psychology of power and resistance. He observed how different families responded to their guard duties, studying social dynamics within the Taichuid camp. Most importantly, he maintained dignity and composure that impressed even his captors. The opportunity for escape came during one of the Taichu's periodic celebrations, when alcohol and festivities created relaxed atmosphere. When celebrations reached their peak and his guard's attention was focused on entertainment, Temujin struck with the heavy Cangue itself, using the device that had tormented him as a weapon. The blow was precisely calculated to render the guard unconscious without killing him. His escape route led to the Onon River, where he hid among reeds and tall grasses. The choice was tactically sound. Water would mask his scent from tracking dogs, while dense vegetation provided concealment. The discovery by Sorkhan Shira was the crucial moment that transformed temporary escape into genuine freedom. When the man who had shown him kindness found him hiding, Temujin faced a life-or-death gamble on human character. Sorkin Shira's decision to help, rather than betray him, represented one of those pivotal moments where individual moral choice shapes the destiny of nations. By sheltering Temujin for 3 days while search parties scoured the area, this relatively obscure tribesman ensured that the future Genghis Khan would survive to build his empire. When Temujin finally rejoined his family after his long captivity and dramatic escape, he was no longer the boy who had been captured. The experience had taught him crucial lessons about power, resistance, and inspiring loyalty, even among potential enemies. Most importantly, he had learned that even in darkest circumstances, there were people willing to risk everything to help someone they recognized as worthy of their sacrifice. The boy who had been captured for killing his half-brother had become a young man ready to build an empire. Chapter 6. The Stranger Who Chose Loyalty. The months following Temujin's escape should have brought recovery and rebuilding. Instead, they marked the beginning of new challenges that would test his emerging abilities as a leader capable of inspiring loyalty from strangers. During his absence, his family had managed to improve their circumstances through successful hunting, careful trading, and gradually rebuilding relationships with distant relatives. Most importantly, they had acquired a small herd of 9 horses that represented not just wealth and transportation, but the foundation of any hope for rebuilding their position in Mongol society. But wealth on the steppes was always precarious, especially for families without strong tribal protection. The very success that had allowed them to accumulate horses also made them attractive targets for raiders who preyed on isolated households. The horse thieves who targeted their camp demonstrated professional competence that marked them as experienced predators. They approached during the darkest hours before dawn, moving with practiced stealth to gather 8 of the 9 horses without creating enough disturbance to alert the sleeping household. The theft was discovered only when the family began their morning routine and found their carefully accumulated wealth reduced to a single remaining animal. The loss was devastating on multiple levels that went far beyond simple property. From a practical standpoint, 8 horses represented years of effort. From a strategic standpoint, the theft reduced their mobility and military options to almost nothing. Most importantly, it represented a direct challenge to Temujin's developing reputation as a leader capable of protecting his family. The decision to pursue the horse thieves was made with full awareness of the enormous risks involved. Tracking professional raiders across unfamiliar territory with only 1 remaining mount was a desperate gamble. But the alternative was acceptance of a loss that would probably doom the entire family to permanent poverty and vulnerability. The pursuit itself became intensive education in tracking and wilderness survival that would prove invaluable during later military campaigns. Following the trail of 8 horses across varied terrain required detailed attention and persistent focus that would later characterize his approach to strategic intelligence gathering. The encounter with Boochu came when Temujin had been following the thieves' trail for what seemed like an entire day. He had stopped at a herder's camp to ask if anyone had seen 8 horses being driven through the area. The young man he encountered was engaged in the routine task of milking animals, a peaceful domestic activity that provided sharp contrast to the violent urgency of Temujin's mission. Bo Orchu's reaction revealed character traits that would make him one of the most valued companions in Genghis Khan's eventual empire, rather than simply providing information or politely declining involvement. He immediately abandoned his current task and offered both assistance and resources. Without knowing anything about Temujin beyond the basic facts of his situation, Bo Orchu gave him a fresh horse and volunteered to join the pursuit. The decision to provide such immediate and comprehensive assistance to a complete stranger was remarkable by any standard, but especially extraordinary in the context of steppe politics, where helping the wrong person could result in deadly retaliation. Bo Orchu had no way of knowing whether Temujin was a legitimate victim seeking justice or a criminal whose actions might bring trouble. Yet he chose to act based on instinctive recognition that the young man before him possessed qualities worthy of support. The successful recovery of the stolen horses was accomplished through persistence, skill, and coordinated action that impressed both participants with each other's capabilities. More importantly, the shared success created bonds of trust and respect that would prove crucial to Temujin's later rise to power. Bo Orchu's response to their successful collaboration was as remarkable as his initial offer had been. When Temujin attempted to reward him, the young man refused material compensation while simultaneously acknowledging Temujin's authority and expressing willingness to serve as his nukkur, a free companion who chose loyalty based on personal conviction rather than tribal obligation. The decision to abandon his own family and attach himself permanently to Temujin was extraordinary by Mongol standards, where family loyalty was considered fundamental. Bo Orchu's choice suggested recognition that the young man he had helped possessed potential for greatness that outweighed conventional social expectations. This recognition would prove prophetic, but at the time, it represented a remarkable act of faith in someone whose future prospects appeared limited. The encounter with Bo Orchu and the successful recovery of the stolen horses represented a crucial turning point in Temujin's development from survivor to leader. For the first time, he had demonstrated the ability to inspire loyalty and coordinate effective action with someone who had chosen to follow him based on recognition of his potential rather than family obligation or desperate circumstance. But perhaps most importantly, the incident demonstrated that Temujin possessed the kind of personal magnetism and natural authority that could inspire extraordinary acts of loyalty from virtual strangers. This quality would prove essential as he began building the military force that would eventually reshape the balance of power across continents. Chapter 7. The Bride Price. The successful recovery of the stolen horses and Bo Orchu's commitment marked a turning point. But personal achievements alone could not establish the legitimacy Temujin needed to build real power. At 16, he had reached the age when marriage was essential for any young man hoping to be taken seriously as a potential leader. The betrothal arranged by his father years earlier with Berta of the Ongirat tribe represented his best opportunity to transition from outcast survivor to recognized adult with legitimate claims to authority. The marriage arrangement had been negotiated 7 years earlier when both families were in very different circumstances. Yesuge had been traveling in search of a suitable wife for his 8-year-old son when fate intervened in the form of Dei Sechen, an Ongirat chieftain who claimed to have dreamed of Yesuge's arrival with his son. Taking this as a favorable omen, Dei Sechen had proposed his 10-year-old daughter Berta as a bride for young Temujin. But that had been before Yesuge's death, the family's abandonment, and years of desperate survival that had reduced them to poverty and marginalization. Now, as Temujin prepared to claim his promised bride, he faced the very real possibility that Dei Sechen might have reconsidered the arrangement. The journey to claim Berta was undertaken with careful planning. Temujin traveled with Bo-Chu, whose presence provided visible evidence that others were willing to attach themselves to his cause. Crucial in tribal societies, where success was measured partly by one's ability to attract followers. When they reached Dei Sechen's camp, Temujin's reception revealed both challenges and opportunities created by his family's recent history. The Ongirat leader's initial surprise at seeing the young man he had assumed was probably dead gave way to careful evaluation. Dei Sechen had heard stories of Temujin's survival, escape from captivity, and recent successes, tales that suggested capabilities beyond what might be expected from someone his age and circumstances. Berta herself proved as impressive as her father had claimed. The young woman who had been promised to Temujin in childhood had grown into someone whose intelligence and strength would make her a valuable partner. Her willingness to proceed with the marriage despite his family's reduced circumstances demonstrated both loyalty to previous commitments and recognition that Temujin possessed qualities that transcended temporary material disadvantages. The wedding gift that would prove most significant came from Berta's parents, a magnificent black sable coat that represented far more than material wealth. In Mongol society, such prestigious items carried symbolic weight that transcended their immediate value. The coat was diplomatic currency that could open doors to relationships with powerful leaders. Hoelun's decision regarding the coat demonstrated the strategic thinking that had kept their family alive. Rather than keeping the valuable garment for their own use, she chose to let Temujin use it as a diplomatic tool. The coat could provide warmth and status, but properly employed in political negotiations, it might establish connections that could transform their entire future. Hoelun's choice of recipient revealed sophisticated understanding of regional power structures. Togrul, the Karaite leader known as Ong Khan, was one of the most powerful figures in central Mongolia. More importantly, he had been Yesuge's sworn brother, an Anda relationship that theoretically created obligations that survived the death of one partner. The journey to Togrul's court represented another calculated risk that could either establish Temujin as a legitimate political actor or confirm his continued marginalization. The presentation of the sable coat was conducted with all the diplomatic ceremony that such an important moment required. Temujin approached not as a supplicant seeking charity, but as the son of a former ally offering a valuable gift that demonstrated both respect and capability. Togrul's response exceeded even Hoelun's strategic expectations. The powerful leader not only accepted the precious coat, but welcomed Temujin into his protection with words that formally established their relationship. In return for the sable coat, I shall unite for you your scattered people. In return for the sable coat, I shall bring together for you your divided people. This declaration provided immediate practical benefits by announcing that attacks on Yasugi's son would be considered attacks on the Kerit themselves. But the relationship was even more important in political terms, since it gave Temujin legitimacy and access to resources that could enable him to begin building his own following. With Berta as his wife, connecting him to the influential Ongirat tribe, and Togrul as his patron, providing protection and political legitimacy, Temujin had achieved a transformation that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The desperate fugitive who had escaped from Taichur captivity was becoming a recognized political actor with growing prospects for building real power. But the very success that had restored his family's position also created new vulnerabilities that enemies would be eager to exploit. The Merkit tribe had not forgotten that Yasuke had stolen Hoelun from one of their men years earlier, and they had been waiting for the right moment to exact their revenge. Now that Temujin had something precious to lose, they were finally ready to strike. Chapter 8. The Dawn Raid. The months following Temujin's marriage to Berta and his successful alliance with Togrul should have marked the beginning of stability and prosperity, with political protection from the powerful Kerit leader and marriage connections to the influential Ongirat tribe. The foundation seemed solid for building security, but the steps had their own rules about justice and revenge, and some grievances ran too deep to be erased by changing political circumstances. The Merkit Confederation had been nursing their hatred against Yasugai's family for over 2 decades, ever since the day when the young Mongol warrior had stolen Hoelun from her new husband as the couple traveled back to Merkit territory after their wedding ceremony. The abduction had been more than simple bride theft. It had struck at the heart of Merkit honor and demonstrated their inability to protect their own people. In tribal societies, where reputation often provided the only protection against stronger neighbors, such humiliations demanded blood payment regardless of how much time had passed. The specific target of their revenge had been carefully chosen to maximize both practical and symbolic impact. Hoelun had originally been engaged to Yehe Chiladu, younger brother of the Merkit leader Toktoa Beki, making her abduction not just a crime against their tribe, but a personal injury to their ruling family. Now, a generation later, taking Temujin's wife would inflict the same kind of loss and humiliation on Yasugai's son that had been suffered by Chiladu all those years earlier. The war party that set out to capture Berta represented a serious military undertaking. 300 warriors under the leadership of Toktoa Beki of the Uduid Merkit, Dair Usun of the Uvas Merkit, and Kartai Dharmala of the Kard Merkit had been assembled specifically for this mission. The force was large enough to overwhelm any resistance that Temujin's small household could mount. The timing of their strike had been calculated to catch Temujin's camp at its most vulnerable moment. The attack came during the period when Temujin had been making ritual circuits around Burkhan Khaldun, the sacred mountain that his family considered their spiritual refuge. This religious observance required him to be away from his main camp for extended periods, creating opportunities for enemies to approach undetected. The raiders approached during the darkest hours before dawn, using their superior knowledge of local terrain to move within striking distance without alerting the sleeping occupants. The first warning came from an old woman in the camp whose acute hearing had been sharpened by decades of survival on the dangerous steppes. The distant thunder of 300 horses' hooves reached her ears when the raiders were still far enough away that escape might be possible for those who could react quickly enough. The chaos that followed revealed both the family's survival instincts and the terrible arithmetic of steppe warfare. As people scrambled to mount horses and flee toward the safety of nearby mountains, it became immediately clear that there were not enough animals for everyone to escape. In the desperate moments that followed, impossible choices had to be made with no time for careful consideration. Temujin faced the agonizing decision of whether to stay and fight hopeless odds in defense of his family, or preserve himself and his core followers for a possible rescue attempt later. The mathematics were brutal but unavoidable. Staying to fight would mean certain death for everyone, while escaping would at least preserve the possibility of eventual retaliation and rescue. The decision to abandon Berta was made in the context of these impossible circumstances, but it would haunt Temujin for the rest of his life. As he rode desperately toward the mountains with his brothers and the few followers who had managed to find horses, he was forced to listen to the sounds of his wife's capture echoing across the grasslands behind him. The flight to Burkhan Khaldun became a harrowing test of endurance as Merkit pursuit parties attempted to run down the escaping family members. When they finally reached the secure refuges high on the mountain slopes, Temujin was no longer the confident young leader who had been building alliances and attracting followers. The successful attack had stripped away his illusions about the adequacy of political protection and revealed the fundamental vulnerability that came from lacking overwhelming military strength. The Merkits' treatment of their captive reflected both their desire for revenge and their understanding of the symbolic importance of their prize. Berta was not simply enslaved or mistreated, but was formally given to Chilgabuku, the younger brother of the same Chiladu, from whom Ho'elun had been stolen decades earlier. This assignment completed the symmetry of revenge that the Merkits had planned. But the psychological impact on Temujin was far more significant than the Merkits could have anticipated. The loss of his wife was not just a personal tragedy, but a political disaster that threatened to undo all the progress he had made toward building legitimate authority. Unless he could mount an effective rescue operation, his reputation as a leader worth following would be destroyed permanently. The days of hiding in the mountain refuges provided time for the kind of strategic thinking that would characterize Temujin's approach to military problems for the rest of his career. Simply accepting the loss was impossible, both emotionally and politically, but mounting a successful rescue would require resources and allies currently beyond his reach. His own following was too small to challenge 300 Merkid warriors, and even Togrul's protection could not be assumed to extend to offensive operations. The solution lay in relationships that transcended immediate political calculation. His sworn brotherhood with Jamukha, forged during their childhood, created obligations based on personal loyalty rather than material advantage. More importantly, Jamukha commanded substantial forces and had his own reasons for opposing Merkid power in their region. Together with Togrul's military strength, they might be able to assemble a coalition powerful enough to overwhelm Merkid defenses and recover his captured wife. As Temujin prepared to emerge from his mountain sanctuary and begin the dangerous process of building this rescue coalition, he understood that the stakes involved far more than personal happiness. The successful recovery of Berta would demonstrate that attacks on his family carried unacceptable costs, while failure would confirm his status as a leader too weak to protect those under his care. But perhaps most importantly, the Merkid raid had awakened something cold and calculating in his character that would influence every decision he made for the rest of his life. He had learned that building alliances and inspiring loyalty were insufficient to protect those he loved. True security required the kind of overwhelming military strength that could deter attacks before they began, and exact terrible retribution when deterrence failed. The 8 months that Berta would spend in captivity would be 8 months of planning, building alliances, and preparing for the kind of coordinated military campaign that would establish his reputation as a leader capable of protecting his people and destroying his enemies. Chapter 9. The Coalition of Sworn Brothers. The sacred slopes of Burkan Khaldun had provided sanctuary during the darkest hours following the Merkid raid, but they could not offer the practical solutions that Temujin's crisis demanded. The recovery of Berta would require the kind of coordinated military campaign that exceeded anything his small following could attempt alone, forcing him to transform from a leader of desperate survivors into a commander capable of managing complex alliances between powerful and potentially unreliable partners. The arithmetic of the challenge was sobering. The Merkid Confederation had demonstrated their military capability through the successful dawn attack, and their 300 experienced warriors represented a force that could easily overwhelm any direct assault he might mount with his current resources. His own following, while completely loyal, numbered perhaps 20 men. Individual courage and devotion could not overcome such overwhelming numerical disadvantage in open battle. The first and most crucial approach had to be made to Togrul, the Kharid leader whose promises of protection had been tested and found wanting during the Merkid attack. The sable coat gift had created obligations that Togrul himself had acknowledged, but asking for military support in an offensive operation would test whether those obligations extended beyond simple defensive assistance. When they finally stood before the powerful Kharid leader, Temujin's words were crafted to invoke both personal obligation and strategic necessity. The 3 Merkid came, taking us by surprise. They seized my wife and carried her off. We have come now to ask you, Wang Khan, my father, to rescue my wife and return her to me. Togrul's response demonstrated both his political sophistication and his genuine commitment to their relationship. Rather than offering limited assistance or expressing sympathy while avoiding concrete commitments, he immediately acknowledged full responsibility for helping to recover Berta and promised comprehensive military support. In return for the sable coat, I shall unite for your scattered people. In return for the sable coat, I shall bring together for you your divided people. But it was Togrul's strategic thinking that transformed a simple rescue mission into a sophisticated military campaign. He immediately recognized that the operation would require additional allies and suggested bringing Jamuka into the coalition, demonstrating his understanding that the mission could serve to re-establish cooperation between the two sworn brothers while providing the military strength necessary for certain success. Togrul promised to contribute 2 units of 10,000 warriors to form the left wing of the attacking force, while his brother Jaka Gambu would command an additional unit of 10,000. This represented a substantial commitment of Kerit military resources to a campaign that would primarily benefit Temujin's family. The message that Temujin was instructed to convey to his sworn brother was carefully crafted to appeal to both personal loyalty and strategic opportunity. Give my sworn friend Jamuka this message. When the 3 Merkid came, my bed was made empty. You and I, are we not from one family? How shall we take our revenge? My breast is torn apart. You and I, are we not of kindred blood? How shall we avenge this injury? This message skillfully transformed what might have been perceived as Temujin's personal problem into a challenge to their sworn brotherhood and an opportunity for Jamuka to demonstrate his own honor and military capability. When Kasa and Belgute finally delivered both Temujin's personal message and Togrul's formal proposal for military cooperation, Jamuka's response demonstrated both his continuing loyalty to their childhood bond and his sophisticated understanding of the military and political implications of the proposed campaign. To know that my sworn friend Temujin's bed has become empty brought pain to my heart. To know that his breast was torn apart brought pain to my liver. Taking our revenge, wiping out the Uduit and Uvas Merkit, we shall rescue our Lady Berta. But it was Jamuka's detailed tactical knowledge that proved most valuable for planning the actual rescue operation. His intelligence about specific Merkit leaders and their probable locations provided crucial information for coordinating effective attacks against dispersed enemy forces. The force structure that Jamuka proposed revealed both his military capability and his understanding of coalition politics. He would contribute 2 units of 10,000 warriors, composed of 1 unit taken from Temujin's own people and 1 from his own forces. This arrangement would provide Temujin's followers with meaningful participation in their leader's rescue mission, while ensuring that Jamuka retained command authority over a substantial portion of the Allied army. The coordination of the rescue campaign required weeks of careful planning to synchronize the movements of forces that had never operated together under commanders who needed to establish working relationships under pressure of time and strategic necessity. When the combined forces finally reached Botokamboji at the source of the Onon River, they discovered that Jamuka had arrived at the meeting place 3 days earlier. demonstrating both his efficiency in military movement and his serious commitment to the rescue mission. The assembled coalition represented the most powerful military force that had operated in the region for years, with sufficient numerical strength to overwhelm any resistance the Merkits might organize. As the Allied armies prepared for their advance toward the Selenga River region where the Merkits had established their camps, Temujin understood that the stakes involved far more than personal happiness or family reunification. Success would demonstrate that he could inspire loyalty from powerful partners, manage complex relationships between leaders with potentially competing interests, and achieve strategic objectives through careful planning and determined execution. Failure would not only mean the permanent loss of his wife, but the destruction of his reputation as a leader worthy of alliance and support. Chapter 10. The Night of Reunion. The Allied army that advanced toward Merkit territory in the late summer of 1180 represented the most formidable military coalition that the Mongolian steppes had seen in years. 4 units of 10,000 warriors, commanded by experienced leaders who had coordinated their movements with disciplined efficiency, moved across the grasslands with the precision that would later characterize the great Mongol campaigns of conquest. The march itself became an intensive course in coalition warfare that would influence every strategic decision Temujin made for the rest of his career. Observing how Togrul and Jamukha coordinated the movement of their separate commands, managed supplies across vast distances, and maintained discipline among warriors from different tribal traditions, provided invaluable insights into the practical challenges of commanding armies that would eventually span continents. The intelligence that had been gathered about Merkit dispositions proved remarkably accurate. As the Allied forces approached the Selenga River basin, advance scouts confirmed that the 3 main Merkit leaders were indeed positioned exactly where Jamukha's intelligence had predicted. The decision to launch the attack during the night reflected both strategic calculation and the psychological understanding that would later characterize Temujin's approach to warfare. Night assaults were particularly effective against enemies who relied primarily on mounted combat, since horses became less reliable in darkness, and the confusion that inevitably accompanied such attacks favored the side with superior numbers and better coordination. When the assault finally began, the results exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of the Allied commanders. The Merkits, caught completely unprepared by the scale and coordination of the night attack, offered only scattered and ineffective resistance before beginning the kind of panicked flight that their leaders' reputations had suggested would occur under pressure. The psychological impact was as devastating as the military effects. The sight of thousands of warriors emerging from the darkness created the kind of paralyzing fear that made rational tactical decisions impossible for enemy commanders already known for their tendency to panic under pressure. At night, the Merkit people fled in disarray down the Selenga River, but even in the night, the Allied troops were pressing hard after the hastily fleeing Merkit. It was during this frenzied pursuit that the moment every participant had been hoping for finally arrived. As the pillaging and plundering went on, Temujin moved among the people that were hurriedly escaping, calling, "Berta, Berta!" And so he came upon her, for Lady Bertha was among those fleeing people. She heard the voice of Temujin, and recognizing it, she got off the cart and came running towards him. It was moonlight. He looked at them, recognized Lady Bertha, and they fell into each other's arms. This moment of reunion represented far more than personal happiness for a husband recovering his wife after 8 months of separation and anxiety. It demonstrated to all observers that Temujin possessed the kind of loyalty-inspiring leadership that could motivate powerful allies to risk their own forces and resources for his personal objectives. More importantly, it proved that he could successfully coordinate complex military operations that achieved their intended goals despite significant logistical and tactical challenges. The immediate aftermath of the successful rescue revealed both the extent of the Allied victory and the practical wisdom that would characterize Temujin's approach to military campaigns throughout his career. That very night, he sent a message to Togrul Khan and to sworn friend Jamukha saying, "I have found what I was looking for. Let us not travel all night. Let us camp here." The decision to halt the pursuit and consolidate their victory, rather than continuing the chase, demonstrated strategic restraint that prevented the kind of overextension that could turn triumph into disaster. But it was the condition in which Bertha was recovered that would create consequences extending far beyond the immediate celebration of the rescue mission's success. The 8 months of captivity had left their mark in ways that would influence Mongol politics for generations to come. Soon after her recovery, it became clear that she was pregnant, carrying a child whose parentage would remain forever uncertain due to her time among her captors. The son who would be born from this pregnancy, a boy who would be named Jochi, meaning guest, would carry throughout his life the uncertainty about his true father that resulted from his mother's captivity. Despite this ambiguity, Temujin would claim the child as his own and treat him as a legitimate son and potential heir. But the whispers about Jochi's parentage would never entirely disappear, creating fractures within the imperial family that would eventually contribute to the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire decades later. The successful completion of the rescue mission should have marked the beginning of a period of celebration and strengthened alliance between the three leaders who had cooperated so effectively. But even as Temujin held his recovered wife and contemplated the magnitude of what had been accomplished, subtle signs were already appearing that would eventually transform his greatest political asset into his most dangerous rival. Jamukha's role in the rescue mission had been absolutely crucial to its success, and his military capability had proven equal to, or perhaps superior to, Temujin's own. The sworn brotherhood that had made their cooperation possible was also creating expectations and obligations that might prove difficult to manage as both leaders continued building their separate power bases in the same region. The success of their joint military operation had demonstrated that together they possessed the kind of combined strength that could dominate the entire area. But it had also revealed that their individual ambitions might not be compatible with continued partnership as equals. The very effectiveness of their collaboration was beginning to raise questions about which of the two sworn brothers would eventually emerge as the dominant leader in their shared territory. As the Allied forces prepared for their return journey, carrying with them the fruits of victory and the promise of future cooperation, none of the participants could have predicted that this successful rescue mission would mark both the peak of their collaboration and the beginning of a rivalry that would eventually reshape the political landscape of Mongolia forever. The boy who had learned to survive and command was about to discover that success created its own dangers and that the most deadly enemies were sometimes those who knew you best. The making of Genghis Khan had taken another crucial step forward, but the path ahead would prove more treacherous than any he had yet traveled. The steps would demand one final transformation, from successful war leader to supreme conqueror, and that transformation would require leaving behind the last vestiges of the boy who had once been abandoned to die in the winter cold.